And then speaking of podcasts, one of the other podcasts that I've been listening to and enjoying on a weekly basis is one called Risky Business. They've got a huge worldwide reach. They come out of Australia, but they cover all of the cybersecurity issues that are going on. It's been really fascinating to listen to their take on things like the signal gate issues with the government and how that's all progressing. All these other issues that come out, they kind of rapid fire through a whole bunch of different topics. And I was listening to one of those episodes a few weeks ago that I learned about this company called Knock Knock. And their approach to securing systems I thought was really interesting. And so I reached out to the presenter, who is Adam, who's on the line today, and he agreed to come and kind of share some of his thoughts and insights with us today. The reason that I thought this was really interesting is because if you look at the world of test and measurement and what it means to secure a system in test and measurement, we face kind of a unique challenge where we're not rolling out new systems very often. Mostly we're maintaining older systems, and by older, some of those are very old systems. So we have this kind of unique challenge of how do you update and protect these very old systems? And I don't think it's as easy as saying that there's one solution to that. There's a whole bunch of different solutions. And what I really liked about Adam's approach and Adam's insights into this is how to look at security generally and make sure that you have lots of protections in place, and how do you reduce that attack surface. And so I wanted Adam to kind of come and talk with us today about that. And so I want to introduce Adam. And Adam, did you want to take over and present from your machine?
Yeah, sure thing. I'll share now.
Excellent.
Okay, let me know when that's come up.
I can see it. And I'm going to
Excellent.
interrupt Adam along the way and ask him questions on lieu or in behalf of this group. So
Perfect. Adam Pointon, and Steve said, this presentation's more interactive. I want it to be more of a discussion. It's not too salesy, it's not too death by PowerPoint. So there's a few slides here to sort of keep on track and talk about the message, but let's just get into it. Limiting exposure reduces risk. Pretty simple, but that's kind of the theme of this presentation and what Knock Knock does, how it works, why it works that way, and sort of addresses some fundamental ways of thinking. So the takeaway from this presentation isn't going to be go and buy a Knock Knock. It's going to be attack surface, limiting that, reducing risk, and dealing with an environment that Steve said, you can't just go and patch it all the time. You can't just go and update it or change it. You need to nurse legacy. You need to work in an environment where vulnerabilities are a thing you have to live with at times. So we'll kick off. Attack surface. You guys probably know what attack surface is. It's anything that presents an opportunity of attack of a system. So the car analogy would be, attacking or breaching a car. There's car windows that can be broken. There's door locks. There's key fobs. There's RF attacks against key fobs. There's the phone app that can open the car. There's the entertainment system. There's remote software updates. Denial of service to a car. There's slashing the tires. There's electrical wiring, hoses, fuel tampering, stickers on the radar or parking sensors. These are all examples of attack surfaces of a car, and then within a network, within a system, there's a myriad of these, and it's growing, it's increasing. There's third-party libraries. You've got embedded AI and everything these days, which is kind of who knows doing what, and only from an attacker's perspective, only one weakness in any of that chain is needed to have a bad day, cause harm, breach a system, cause disruption. And there's obviously many countermeasures to this, famous sort of Northrop Grumman style image here, which is showing the layers of defense, the defense in depth idea, which is there's perimeter security, network security, endpoint security, all these elements that go into layers of defense. And then there's things like standards, like NIST 800 series, ISO standards, CMMC, many standards here you're probably familiar with. They're actually useful. Find a way to read them. Notebook LLM, which converts PDFs into a two-sided conversation from Google's really handy to get a summary of some of these papers and then actually read them. because within the NIST 800 series, there's a lot of really good standards and information around OT security or individual specific industries or more general standards. They do a lot of, I'm a big fan of this, but they do a lot to kind of help you understand all these defense in-depth strategies and how they may actually play out in relation to a specific topic within the security arena. Some vendors are really helpful, others not so, in understanding what security issues exist, vulnerabilities exist from time to time, hardening of systems, and NI is actually one of the good ones. So the security program, I'm glad Steve, you mentioned that it's got funding recently or extended funding, because from an outsider's perspective, the program's actually pretty good. Concise information, it's actionable. So not all vendors are like this, but what it comes down to in a lot of terms is patching. So patch your software, patch your hardware, patch everything all the time, patch before it exists. You know, this is an approach that almost is our state of the art. But what about things like patches that I didn't know about if I'm not on that email list? Or what about 0 days? So, you know, 0 days, probably many know this, but it's an attack against a vulnerability, if you like, that nobody else knows about. The vendor doesn't know this vulnerability exists, therefore there's no patch available. And NSA, National Security Agency, noted earlier this year that looking back at 2024, many of the attacks against critical infrastructure, important targets, actually leverage 0 days in 2024. So how do you defend against a vulnerability that there is no patch? You
And
sort of need
Adam,
to exist.
I'll throw in there that patching is really difficult for our systems, right, in test, because we may be running a test that is fairly critical. Like maybe it's got a high power motor that's spinning and doing its thing, and it's going to run for 6 days or 6 weeks or something. And to stop that and apply a patch is extremely difficult and dangerous in many situations. And that's something that we're really struggling with in our industry, is to figure out how do we apply a patching strategy, because patching every day or every hour in most of these systems is simply not an option.
That's right. And you know, famous sort of Eric Goldstein quote here is like, you know, patch faster, fix faster. It's a failed model. Let alone is it disruptive to your environment, as you mentioned, that you know the 0 day thing, and attackers aren't sort of waiting around to attack patch systems. That the acceleration and speed that they're coming up with vulnerabilities, discovering them or exploiting them, are way ahead of a patching cycle. So this idea of you can't patch fast enough, you know, maybe we should just turn the thing off. Which brings me to this, you know, there's robust testing outcome, and what's holding you back is latest vulnerability, the need to patch. You can't patch every hour, every week, every month. As you mentioned, it's disruptive, but you can't not patch. You know, security is important, particularly in the test environment where, you know, you're looking for measurements, you're looking for an outcome, a review of a technical component or a technology itself. You can't just be patching systems around it and updating it. Even if there are patches, even if you can turn the thing off after a 6-day run and redo it, it still is disruptive because you're changing the environment. And the things that you're testing, you mentioned at the start, sort of dealing with legacy, but decisions you may be testing may not be hard, they might be in a default weak configuration. And the impact of not patching, the impact of security issues around that's high because attackers may persist in that environment for some time. So there's ideas like air gapping. Air gapping's great, but it does bring friction, and there's a lot of convergence at the moment, obviously. So there's this kind of idea of just-in-time network access. You know, what if you can have a somewhat air-gapped environment or an environment that is offline until it's online? So that kind of just-in-time network access, which is where Knock Knock was really invented, or why it came about, was to provide this just-in-time network access through orchestrating existing infrastructure. So users log in, Knock Knock manages the network level access to the environment that they're authorized to see, opens that access up, and then when the user sort of logs out, that access is removed. And Knock Knock manages that approach without needing to get in the way of the actual connection through to that network, which is this default deny. So that layers of defense, the other adage of default deny. So no access is possible. There's no network throughput in or out until it is specifically opened up for a period of time for that user based on their IP address or other aspects, depending on configuration. That idea of just-in-time network access is why Knock Knock exists and the approach that it takes. So I'll flip over to a quick demo. On the left here, you've got a user that's visiting a Knock Knock web application to log in. That's a thing that you host in your environment or somewhere. And on the right-hand side, we've got a simple ping. So I'll just play this. I've got the ping on the right. I just start that. I can't get access to this backend system. So on the left-hand side, I've got single sign-on or a local user. In this example, I'll click single sign-on. And as it's gone through that sign-on process, I'm now able to ping because Knock Knock has managed that access to that backend system. So it's this idea of I don't actually have any network level access until I log in. So as soon as I log out, it's orchestrated the firewalls. I can no longer access it. Back in, magically the network opens up.
So what you're doing is you're controlling this so that the system is effectively offline until you tell it you want to be online, but it's not, you're not turning the system on, you're allowing a particular user to come through the firewall. Is that right?
Correct, that's right. So there's an existing firewall in place. It has a policy that says, allow ping through to this system over here. And that's sort of sitting there dormant, if you like, until the user logs in. And then my user is added to the group within the firewall. And then the firewall obviously allows that access through.
I do go
And
see
it's
some like test systems that are idle for weeks at a time while they prepare for this big test, and then this test runs for 20 minutes. And
yeah,
during that whole time that it's on, you kind of need it on so you can do some testing and getting some things ready. But it's there and it's vulnerable. And what you're saying here is that you could set that up so that it's, even if it's on, it's not accessible in any way, so it can't be attacked. And then when you do need to pump the data in and out, you open it up briefly and then shut that door again.
that's right. And it's just for the user that is authorized to do that. The door's only open for them for a period of time. So they might be able to log in for 45 minutes or an hour, and the network level access is just closed. There's just no path through to that network until they've logged in. So the system could be sitting there for weeks, but no network packets can get in because the firewall is blocking everything and only allowing that user once they've gone through this knock process.
Is it only tied to users? So here you did it with with a username. Sometimes our systems are communicating from system to system. Can it be set up to allow a system through that as well?
Yeah, so we've got customers that are scripting this process. So they basically log in to Knock Knock as part of a scripting process. And that's quite common where there's large data transfers. So as part of the high performance computing world, they need to move, petabytes of data around through scripting and automation. So they're using Knock Knock to log in, and then the second step is to go and transfer all that data. And then on success of the data transfer, they log out, which removes that access.
So that would be easy to implement in our systems, right? Where we're collecting all of this test data, and at the end of the test, we want to share that data out to the central server. Then you'd initiate this login, send it over, and then close that back down.
Yeah, so in that example, it would be pushing data after the test run through to the collection system, if you like. The alternative would be to pull from the system that you've run all the tests, and that data sitting there to extract that data back out. But only after this login process. So the network's just inaccessible until this just-in-time access is provisioned at that network layer.
Mhm.
So I'll show you one more example, which is SSH. So ping's sort of the simplest of demos. The next level of SSH. The other part of this demo is we intentionally add friction so that it's not about just logging in. It's about logging in and then requesting access through to that backend. So I'll just let this one play out. So I'm able to log in, and there's a ping demo example there. But just below that is an SSH demo. So if I try and log in, I have to click this click to grant for it to then actually provide that access through. So I've got the login process, but I've also then got a specific I want to access this system now. So again, click on the click to grant, and then you can see on the right-hand side, it's only at that moment that the network access is opened up and the user's able to log in. So I've revoked it, I can now log in. So what's sort of happening here is, you've got the step one on the left-hand side, the staff member, contractor, etc. Logs into Knock Knock. The agent is essentially, in this example, subscribed, waiting for these events to occur. It then gets that IP address information and goes through and adds that IP address to the firewall. In this example, it's sort of on the host for SSH, and then the user connects directly through to the service. So as opposed to a VPN or a broker service, Knock Knock doesn't actually get in the way of the transaction. The user still connects directly through to the system, and Knock Knock's really just opened up access or permitted the user to get through to that backend service, which is different. It's a different way of doing it. Rather than sitting in the middle of the transaction, we don't want to be there. We just want to manage access, orchestrate it, and then have the user continue on, which is important in an internal environment where you have lots of data being moved around.
You're also only giving the user access to that one port, right? Through the firewall. You're not giving them blanket access to the entire system. That's how it's different than logging into the system, is that it's blocking by port.
That's right. It's blocking by port, IPv4, IPv6, any port, or any protocol, because it's actually adding them to the firewall policy. It's not editing the policy itself. It's just adding their IP address or their source information through to the firewall. So your firewall administrators are still setting up all of those controls. They're saying block everything except allow ping or allow SSH or allow remote access to this system. And then that sort of sits there with an empty list until Knock Knock adds the information, the IP address into that list, and then the user can get through. So it's adding to that policy dynamically. So that's, I can just mute Matt there. Knock Knock manages third-party firewalls as well. So this example is where it's actually talking to an API on a firewall. So this can be network security groups, this can be cloud, this can be traditional firewalls. I'll sort of try and stop with the Knock Knock piece of it and shift into this way of thinking. But our idea was, people have firewalls, that's the network layer control, and there's identity, which is the identity platform, single sign-on, etc. So what we do is really glue that identity and that authorization process through to existing network infrastructure, firewall control infrastructure, just in time. So as you mentioned, Steve, that system sitting there, that network sitting there, it's inaccessible at the network layer until the user logs in, and then that access is permitted for a period of time, which could be an hour or it could be until they log out. And we sort of design it for these high security environments. Our philosophy has been security as part of the core product. We don't seek to sit in the middle. We don't want to be a SaaS magic cloud thing. We're good old fashioned on premise. We're air gap friendly. It's about managing access to these internal systems a lot of the time, as opposed to being another product that sits on the internet and has issues itself. We try and not be in the way. I'm not going to go through all these. It's too salesy. I feel like I've talked enough about the sales side of it already. You can share these slides after. But Knock Knock has been built to get going quickly and in existing infrastructure, as opposed to replacing something or needing somebody to run a big project. So kind of what's the result of this? Well, the result is that the system's offline, the network's hidden, the assets are completely inaccessible. Only after they log in can they actually see these systems. And this is this default deny principle. Everything's blocked unless specifically allowed through. The old original way was allow everything and let's kind of block the bad guys. Let's block this random port. Let's block this country. And that's just not really viable. It never really was. It's almost like the string-based matching in the antivirus industry. It was good trying to block the bad things, but it's not sustainable as opposed to flipping it around and blocking everything, and then only specifically allowing this user can get to this network for an hour, and then after that hour, everything goes back to default deny. It can be more challenging to introduce and to flip the network around or access paradigm around, but it's obviously far more effective. And that's not just a knock-knock thing, right? That's an approach. Default deny is an approach to thinking about security to a system. And we've got this kind of word that we say, which is like if a vulnerability cannot be reached, it cannot be exploited. So if you have vulnerabilities in an environment, but you can't actually reach it, you can almost live and nurse with those vulnerabilities for a period of time, or a longer period of time than would otherwise if that system was exposed. And there's that thing a few years ago where a Windows XP machine, I think, would last about 6 or 7 minutes on the raw internet before it was, riddled with malware and you had attackers fighting each other for the machine. That's different these days because no one has XP on the raw internet, so there's less worms and people scanning around for that. But a vulnerable system has a shorter and shorter amount of lifetime where it's not infected or not taken over by an attacker. Yes, on the raw internet, but also within an internal environment where there may be attackers that are laterally moving around the environment. It doesn't last long, having a vulnerability on the internet or in an exposed environment. Come back to the NSA, they talk about an important zero-day or important vulnerability in that space is exploited within 48 hours of being made, the world being made aware of it. It's impossible to patch in that time, very disruptive to patch in that time. So you almost need to be able to nurse or live with these vulnerabilities for some time.
And there's a couple
Okay,
ways to
great.
think about those vulnerabilities too. There's the known vulnerabilities, the CVE vulnerabilities, but also these systems are the ones that we manage that are older. They are vulnerable in many different ways, and it can be intimidating talking to the IT security team when they come and they say, "Here's all the requirements you need to meet," and if we look at those and think, "Well, we're never going to meet those," right? And that could turn into a conversation of, "Well, then you got to turn it off," and that's just
Yeah.
not going to happen. We've got to figure out how to do that. And this is one way to have that kind of negotiation with that security team to say, look, I know that this has all these issues in it. It's going to cost us way too much money to ever fix it, money we don't have. But if we can take it off the network selectively, will this satisfy you and the concerns that you have about security? And those kind of conversations have worked out pretty well as long as you come into that with an honest this is where we're vulnerable, and this is where these things are happening, and this is how I think we can work around that.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned honest and being transparent around the risk. Like, all of those issues need to be tabled because it is a risk-based approach to is this system vulnerable? Okay, what do we do about it? What are the mitigating controls? What if we do this? What if we do that? Can we live in that environment where it has security issues, but they're known? We're restricting outbound, we're restricting inbound, we're doing all these things so that that system can be online for this period. And then after that, we will go through this process to make sure that if it was infected or there was an issue, that will be cleaned up. A lot of monitoring and logging around all of that, but you kind of need to be able to nurse vulnerabilities through. Either known vulnerabilities, unknown vulnerabilities, or systems that are from a third party that you need to run in the environment for a period, but you can't trust it. So I think that trust and being transparent around that is why good security programs actually make a difference. But also this default deny, it's offline until it's online and only for a short period of time, goes a long way in thinking about managing managing systems in the world we live in today, where vulnerabilities exist, they're quick to be exploited, and they present a real risk and disruption to the business of what you're trying to get done.
Hmm.
So, okay, this sounds cool. Go by knock knock. No, that's not what I'm saying. Like, it is this defense in depth, default deny, least privilege way of thinking. Um, these are not things that we've come up with. These are very mature paradigms, but it is a way of thinking. Like, does this thing I'm working on need to be on the internet, on the network? Can I isolate it in the environment for a period of time? And this kind of whole idea of prevention and reducing the risk, adding more layers of defense goes a long way, and it's better than a cure. Threat modeling is really what this is partly about, is thinking about the threats, modeling them through to a system. So what are the entry points? What are the exit points? What are the issues, attack surface, and how do I reduce those permanently or just in time? And how do I operate whilst remaining protected by default? So as you're sort of thinking about setting up these tests, setting up these systems, where are they? What are they exposed to? What do I need data in and out? How do I reduce the exposure of this thing or collection of things so that it can be operated, safely in a secure environment? And if there is a patch in a system that's related to it that comes around, you may not need to pause everything, run all the updates, let IT go and clobber everything, and then reset everything up, because you've got these other compensating controls that reduce the risk. And yeah, if a vulnerability cannot be reached, it cannot be exploited. So taking them away from being accessible goes a long way. But of course, you could also go and buy Knock Knock. So we actually have a single user home lab license that people can use if you do want to play with it in an environment that's free, and allows you to get familiar with that concept. But it is really that concept of just-in-time network access that will grow, I think, because it is so effective in actually preventing risk and exposure to attackers. It's kind of it, Steve. Here's some references. Again, the NI security program, from an outsider's perspective, does look quite good. It is worth reading if you have time. A lot of the CMMC and NIST papers and references that are on there, because it gets you into that way of thinking of, secure, safe by default, least privilege. Again, it goes a long way in operating in a secure environment and preventing vulnerabilities from being exploited or surfacing, and is very effective compared to rapidly patching.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Adam. It's Adam's calling in from Australia. It's very late there, and so I hope our users found this interesting. I did. If they have a next step, if they do want to pursue this a little bit more, the best thing to do is to go to your website and kind of learn more about your products there. And that's just
That's right.
knockknock.io.
Knocknoc.io. It's knoc.io. That QR code will go through to our licensing portal. But yeah, feel free to send me an email or get in touch. And yeah, thanks, Steve, for the opportunity. I'll hand back. Sharing any questions?
All right, Adam. I appreciate that. If we have any more that come to me, I'll forward them over to you. But thanks very much for your time. Have a great rest of your middle of the night.
I do have one question.
Oh, sure, please.
Yeah.
So obviously, like, our firewalls and our networks are managed by our IT department. So how does it work with the rules that they generally push out?
Yeah, so it would coexist with their rules. The IT department would manage the firewall rules themselves, and then Knock Knock would work in conjunction with their existing rules. So IT would probably manage the Knock Knock asset. They would be building the rules, and then your team's access through to Knock Knock would then allow access to those underlying systems. So IT would still need to be involved. It would be their firewalls, unless you have separate firewalls in your environment. And Knock Knock just really talks to those existing assets and says, if it's a Palo Alto or some product like that, it just says this user needs access to this policy in this environment for 4 hours. And then that would orchestrate one of the IT team's existing firewalls and existing rules that are set up there.
Okay, thanks. It sounds like it's another tool that they could use to help manage the network.
Yeah, that's right.
Especially the test system side of it.
Yeah, so if there's a test system network or environment, then you could use Knock Knock to sort of wall that off and provide just-in-time access. So firewalls are very, you set a policy, it's in place and it allows access through to that service all the time. You know, user over here can get access to test network over here, and it's just always on. Whereas Knock Knock allows them to say, well, that's the policy, allow this user into, allow this network, make this network accessible, but the list of people that are that are allowed are only managed by Knock Knock and inserted and removed rapidly based on them logging in. So it turns their firewall policy from being a, set and forget, turn it on, access is always allowed, into a just in time, add this IP address, they can access it for an hour and that's it. So it allows the IT team to turn their firewalls into much more of a dynamic tool, as opposed to just a set and forget it, it's always on.
And I would assume there's logs that they could review to see, well, when rules were set and for how long and things like that.
Precisely. So they get to see the user logging in, they get to see the fact that they requested access through to that environment. So they get to see the time that that occurred. And then when their access is removed by Knock Knock, whether they log out or, it times out. So they get sort of pinpoint accuracy on when the user, who the user was, what authentication they went through, ties into single sign-on, etc. So you get attribution of the user and the precise time that they were able to access through to that network, and then when access was removed.
There's another question here that comes up often in this group, and like your kind of opinion on this. But when my attendees that are here, we often are fighting to get any kind of funding for any kind of system, and so how do you how do you quantify the amount of risk or the value of that risk to not acting, to try to convince leadership that they should be spending money on security investments like this? Have you had any experience with that?
Yeah, I think it's always a hard one around justifying budget, and security is almost seen as a tax as opposed to an enabler, which is always difficult. I think everybody's aware of the cost of a security breach, whether it's disruption, whether it's brand, whether it's everything else that goes with it, whether it's extortion, etc. So I think. Yeah, it's always a hard one. It depends on the environment. How do you justify that? How do you say if we don't do this, something bad will happen? That's the kind of prevention. How do you spend on the vitamins as opposed to the cure after the fact? I think what does help there is standards like CMMC. The NIST standards are saying, well, this is best practice. This is the recommended, standards, but these are the things we're doing. We don't have unlimited budget. We can't just turn the system off. We can't have all these crazy self-defending technologies in place because it costs zillions of dollars. But this is the standard. This is what's recommended. Here's where we think, from a risk-based approach, these are the things that will make the biggest difference for the lowest cost. And these are the things we think we should do this year, because these are the risks that we need to manage based on industry standards, competitive landscape, etc. So I think that risk-based approach is, what's the priority? Where do we put the funding? What's going to get us the biggest bang for the buck? And then focusing on those things is ultimately where most security-based spending decisions are made, and how they're made, that risk-based prioritization.
One of the, I have to do this a lot because I'm constantly trying to get our leadership to invest in security products that we're doing. And what I've found that the whole what if we got attacked, what would that be worth? That is really, really difficult to convince leadership to pay for. So one of the things that's helping, although it's making my job a lot harder, is that as these standards come out, like from the government, these are requirements. If you don't meet these requirements, then you don't get to sell into that market anymore. So if your end customer is the US government or the Department of Defense in some way, then you're not going to be able to sell your products to them. So it's worth whatever your volume is that you want to sell to that marketplace. With the European CRA coming out at the end of 2027, if you're not in a position where you are secure by the end of that time period, you won't be able to sell into Europe. So how much is the European market worth to you? I've gotten a lot more traction with my leadership by talking about that lost business by not complying than I ever have gotten by being scared about ghosts that might come in and haunt us someday.
Yeah, and getting certified around those things goes a long way in saying, from a buyer's perspective, um, if a vendor is saying, well, we've gone through these certifications, we have these requirements, we've been externally audited, therefore you can know that our security of this product or service is good up to this standard. It makes it a lot easier from a buyer's perspective. So yeah, I think it's a great point, Steve. But from the buyer's perspective, it makes sense too. Why would you buy anything that hasn't had a safety standard, or it hasn't had a security standard? Why would you choose the inferior product? Because you're taking on somebody else's risk that's unknown. But yeah, it's a very effective from a
So
vendor.
along those lines, Adam, somebody's asking, is your tool certified? Like, what certifications do you have?
Yeah, we have it. I mean, NIST doesn't actually certify, so we are on the road on the process of doing ISO 27001 certification. We take very secure by default approaches. We have some US federal government customers that operate our software in a FedRAMP environment, and that's because we're not a SaaS. We actually are also common off-the-shelf software. So customers can take our software in high security environments, run it in their own world, have no access. Knocknoc has no access to those systems at all, and it's entirely in our environment. So that's why we've been able to work with some US federal government customers and get that certification isn't needed because of the way the product is built and designed. But yeah, we're continuing along the certification path to have to make that easier to procure.
And then there's one other question. Knocknoc is not it's not a SIM tool, right? SIM is an analyzing the audit logs and stuff that you generate, but it wouldn't be considered a SIM, right?
No, that's right. So we generate a lot of logs intentionally and we share them into SIMs for consumption. The SIM really is an event happened on a firewall, then there was an event on this email service over here, and then there was an event on this IDP, and a SIM gets all of those three different events, these pieces of telemetry, and says, this is a risky event has occurred, we need to look into that. So we're a participant in the SIM world in that when a user logs in, we provide that information to a SIM. This user logged in from this IP address. That's useful to a SIM to then connect the dots later on. But what we do is really about managing the network just in time for that network level access. So as opposed to detecting issues, we sort of prevent and then allow access through.
All right. Thank you, Adam. Really appreciate it. Thanks for all the good questions.
Thanks,
That was really good.